From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello. So I realize I do not look like John Hessler, but we are going to pretend that I am right now to welcome Vince Rossi to the stage, and I'm going to try not to touch his computer right now that is very carefully set up. It is my pleasure to introduce Vince. He is a fantastic innovator and just a lovely person and a colleague within the city as well. And we're so excited to have him at the library today. Vince has a BFA in sculpture from the University of Arts in Philadelphia and graduate level fine arts study at Goldsmiths College, the University of London. From 2004 to 2011, he worked as a sculptor, model maker, and project manager for the Smithsonian's Office of Exhibit Central, and helped produce and manage many Smithsonian exhibits. And I have to say, after speaking with Vince, he has a sort of fabulous history of these different interesting jobs that he does. He's one of those people that are just really sort of fun to talk to, and you sort of wish that you lived his life, you know. So very exciting. From 2011 to present, Vince has worked as a senior 3D program officer for the Smithsonian's Digitization Program Office, building 3D capacity and developing 3D workflows, which is not an easy thing to do. Vince has the remarkable challenge of thinking about access to museum collections, and not just any museum, specifically thinking about access to the Smithsonian's massive collection of varied, and as he's going to suggest, sometimes hidden material. So today he is going to address his innovative and visionary approach to this subject. And Vince's commitment to furthering the Smithsonian's core mission of increasing the diffusion of knowledge is truly inspiring. So we are very pleased to welcome Vince Rossi to the stage.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. So it's an honor to be here. Thanks for hanging out for the last talk. So I want to just start with our contact info website. This will be up again at the end of the presentation. Or you could simply Google Smithsonian 3D, and our link should come up. So a little bit of context. We're here in Washington, D.C., so I'm sure many of you know about the Smithsonian. I'm sure we have some Smithsonian folks in the audience. But for some context, it's, of course, not one museum. It's 19 museums, 9 research centers. We have a national zoo, and we have scientists operating in over 100 countries around the world. So in total, we have 155 million objects, and we simply can't display all these objects. Less than 1% are ever on display at any one time. So some would see this as a huge access problem, but our office really sees it as an amazing opportunity. So here's just a glimpse of, some of the amazing things as a Smithsonian employee I get to see behind the scenes. And our team is really figuring out how we can use a variety of 3D scanning tools to unlock these collections so that we can bring them out to the world and so that they can be used for research, education, and public access. So if we think about, the way humans have documented and use tools to understand and interpret the world around us throughout time. We've used painting, drawing, printmaking, more recently photography, and a variety of digital tools. We've also used a variety of measurement devices. So for thousands of years, we've taken point-to-point measurements. And if we think about how a researcher might analyze a skull, for example, they might take maybe a dozen landmark measurements that describe the morphology of this object. And then, of course, they actually have to be there in the museum to take these measurements. So with a 3D scan, we're able to collect not a dozen measurement points, but we might be collecting millions or sometimes billions of measurement points that describe the surface and morphology of an object. And once we have that data, once we have it in digital form, we're able to unlock a whole new world of research potential. So at a click of a button, we could do surface area or volume calculation, and we could do things that we simply cannot do with the objects if we were holding them in our hands. So this psychedelic rainbow skull we see on the screen is actually an overlay of 2 3D scans. So we're looking at the deviation analysis of every surface on this object. So our team uses a variety of 3D capture methods. This is an example of a 3D laser scanner. We're scanning Abraham Lincoln's life mask. We deliver that content in 2 main ways. One is through our 3D viewer, which I'll be doing a live demo. And then we also make the data available for download. So if you have access to a 3D printer, if you go to the DC Public Library, you can create a 3D print from any of the Smithsonian scans that we have online. So a quick glimpse of our team. We operate behind the scenes. All of the 3D scanning tools we bring to the objects and to the collections. And we document scientific research sites, individual objects, and now we're really trying to turn the corner to document entire collections. I won't go into the details here, but essentially the Smithsonian has everything from insects to airplanes. So there's no one single 3D capture tool we can use. So we use a variety of laser scanners, CT scanners, structured light, and photogrammetry tools that involve using a camera to take photographs of an object and software to create a 3D reconstruction. And I want to make sure we all understand what I mean when I say 3D or 3D model, because it's kind of a loaded term. You might think 3D TV, 3D movie. What I'm talking about is scanning and capturing the geometry of an object. So I won't go through all these layers, but we'll go through the raw data. And Kim touched on this yesterday. It's a similar capture method for some of the deep space objects that she was scanning. This is a point cloud. So generally, this is the raw data that we're collecting. And it's essentially the visualization of a text file. So 0.1 to 1 million of David Livingstone's gun that we scanned here, each has an X, Y, and Z value. So it's essentially a visualization of a text file, and you can literally open up a 3D scan in Microsoft Excel. And then we interpret that data, we process it. So the next step in processing is we essentially connect the dots. So these polygons are much bigger, but we've sort of enlarged them so you can get an idea. Normally it would be much denser than this. So now we can calculate volume. We can also reflect virtual light, and we can apply color to that 3D model. So I'm going to go through 5 use cases that describe some of our projects that we've worked, a number of on-site projects as well as 3D scanning objects. And at the end of the talk, I can describe our whole new vision and plans over the next 2 years and how we're hoping to shift from going from these one-off objects, which are incredible stories, to scanning entire collections. So here we are in the Atacama Desert. This is in 2011, and they were widening the Pan American Highway, and they uncovered over 40 complete fossil whale specimens. Dr. Nicholas Pyenson, the curator of fossil marine mammals, was blown away when he saw this site. He called our team down to Chile, and luckily we were able to respond pretty quickly. So if you look at the traditional method of documentation for a site like this, you draw a meter by meter string line across the site, and then you sketch the approximate location of each fossil in the ground. So our team was able to take that level of documentation to a much higher level. We used a LiDAR system, a laser arm scanner, and a photogrammetry tools, and we combined all of those 3 data sets to create cohesive models, as well as scans of the entire environment. So the fossils themselves, the Pan American Highway was widened, the fossils were extracted from the ground, but they were encased in tons of dirt and earth and rock. So they were not going to see the light of day for years. Our team, after capturing the 3D data, with them being back from the site, I think it was 5 days, we created 3D prints for the researcher, for the director of the Natural History Museum, as well as for National Geographic. They helped fund this project. In the bottom left-hand corner, that looks like a photograph, but essentially it's a render derived from the 3D data. So One might think like, okay, you could just send a drone up and take a picture, but then you would have lens distortion. With an orthographic rendering, we can take accurate measurements in the X and Y direction. And we're also looking at the 3D data in 2D. So on the right side of the screen, that's essentially the elevation map, the grayscale. And it was important for these researchers who didn't have proficiency in 3D tools to have an easy way to analyze the 3D scans. We also partnered with 3D Systems. They helped us create the largest museum quality 3D print in the world. This is about 23 feet long. And for those of you who are familiar with 3D printing, that is incredibly massive. Normally 3D prints are much smaller. Ping Fu, who was the vice president of 3D Systems, helped make this donation happen. And this hangs in the Natural History Museum. So essentially with this project, we have scientists bringing home data instead of fossils. So we have a new form of collecting happening. We created this 23-foot 3D print for exhibit display. A scientific research paper was created, and it was published in the Royal Society. And as someone who has a degree in sculpture, I found myself kind of blown away that suddenly I'm a co-author for a paper in the Research Society. And then, of course, public access. All of the data that we create, usually we start supporting a research project. We make that data available for the public through our 3D viewer and also as a download. So we make the data available in the highest resolution possible. So this next project I'm going to talk about is a collaboration with the Office of Repatriation at the Smithsonian. This was an incredible story. We have this object that's a killer whale hat. And the Repatriation Office has over 14,000 funerary remains that are being repatriated to the rightful owners of these objects. But after these objects are repatriated, there's often not much of a record left behind. So we partnered with this office as well as the Tlingit community. And really, this was the first time that the Smithsonian ever repatriated an object to a community, and they brought it back for further documentations. This was kind of a pretty cool experiment that we thought worked out really well. So here we are scanning the object. Here's the raw data. And then we took that data and we partnered with the Office of Exhibit Central, and we essentially fed that 3D data into a milling machine, and we partnered really closely with the community. And we worked with the traditional wood carver, and he supplied us with the type of wood that he would have used to create a replica. And it was interesting because I didn't, as a maker myself, I wasn't sure how he was going to react to this technology. And his response was really interesting. He said, you know, when chainsaws became mass produced, Native communities saw them as useful tools, and we used them. And his perspective was that he saw this 3D scanning and CNC milling technique as just another tool that could be in his toolbox. So here we are presenting the replica at the Clan conference in Sitka, Alaska. And what was really interesting is that the community immediately started brainstorming about, okay, how could we use this technology? And there were some tragic stories where they had, I think it was a dozen of these hats that are incredibly sacred, and they've been passed along from generation to generation. So in some cases, they're hundreds of years old. And one of the houses burnt down, and they lost 12 of these objects. And immediately where they went was that we could use this technology to archive these sacred objects that we have. And if something was to happen, we could create replicas for their own ceremonial use. Another interesting, unexpected thing that happened with this project is that from our perspective, we thought we were making a replica for museum display. But when we presented it at the Clan conference, the community took this replica and brought it on stage with the actual object and danced with it. So they breathed new life into this object. And usually if you think about the journey of an object that ends up landing in a museum, that's usually the end of the story. And here's an example of that story continuing through this replica process. So we had a really deep partnership with the Tlingit community. The data is archived for the community and for the Smithsonian. The object replica remains on display, and part of the agreement we had with the Tlingit clan is that whenever they're in Washington, D.C., they reserve the right to dance with this hat, and this has already happened twice, which I think is amazing. This idea of, you know, a museum object is usually, you know, sitting dusty in a vitrine, and no one ever touches it. And here we have this replica object that actually gets pulled off display and is danced with by the community. And then, of course, we make the model available for viewing online with our 3D viewer, but not available for downloads. That's not something that the community wanted us to do, and of course, we respected that. So another on-site project. Excuse me. So here we have, this is at historic Jamestowne, a collaboration between our team, Dr. Douglas Owsley, a forensic anthropologist, and the historic Jamestowne team. Another example of a finding happening through a construction project. So these graves were essentially stumbled upon. And our team was called down to scan each individual grave as well as the site itself. So we used a variety of 3D capture methods to do documentation. And this proved to be really important because once these remains were pulled from the ground, you could see, especially with the rib cage, you could see that there's sort of a defined rib cage on the 3D scan with the objects still encased in earth. But once the remains were removed by the forensic anthropologists, a lot of it literally turned to dust. So we've captured this research moment in time, not just as a picture, but as measurable, three-dimensional scientific data. So we're documenting a site where context is completely lost. Once the remains are removed from the earth, they're extremely fragmented and incomplete. And the 3D documentation and visualizations supported not only the science, but also a lot of media outreach. The 3D renders we created ended up being on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And then these models are also available for viewing and downloading on our website. So moving over to the Air and Space Museum, the Apollo 11 command module. This was a great collaboration between one of our main technology partners, Autodesk. They make a lot of 3D software. So I'm not sure if anyone has seen this version of the display. It's actually, the display has changed. But for decades, it was encased in this plexiglass vitrine. And if you were an adult and you were tall enough, you could, kind of peek into the window and see what was going on. But if you're a kid, forget about it. You couldn't see what was going on inside. So we got word that this object was coming off display, the vitrine was being taken off, and we partnered with the Air and Space Museum to do an incredible level of documentation on this object. And of course, for context, the Apollo command module sat on top of the Saturn V rocket. We were not able to get inside the command module, of course. So we had to design a number of systems and motion control systems that reached inside that allowed us to do 3D scanning. That was really one of the main challenges. So here we have some renderings. These are renderings from the 3D data. They look like photographs. And this was really a great example of a public-private partnership. We could not have done this project under our own strength. Autodesk, our technology partner, they invented software to deal with the volume of data that we were collecting, as well as the 6 different 3D scanning tools that we used with varying resolutions and accuracy levels. And combining that to create one seamless 3D model is extremely challenging. So for us, we have this amazing world-class 3D model of the command module. And for Autodesk, it was really a way to drive innovation for them as a software company. And then through the 3D scanning process, something unexpected happened. We uncovered a number of what the curator called astronaut graffiti. And here we have an inspirational quote by Michael Collins, "The best ship to come down the line, God bless her," which was pretty cool. There were also some less inspirational writings on the walls. One in particular said "smelly waste," and it was a reminder not to open up this door for obvious reasons. So here we have a rendering of the 3D model. So we have, again, an example of, we have a 3D scan, and we're using this asset in many different ways. High-resolution 2D renders, high-resolution 3D animations. And again, the curator himself, who had studied this object for decades, never allowed himself to go inside of this object because it posed too much risk. The object is from 1969. There's plastic that has degraded. The fabric is degraded. We're able to do things, again, that we simply cannot do with the physical object. We can look at the negative space, be outside of the crew chamber and in between the walls of the command module. So here we have a photo of the handsome Mr. Collins in 1969. I had the good fortune to meet Mr. Collins in 2017, and this was really amazing. It was an incredible experience because we virtually put Michael Collins, the pilot of the command module, back into the pilot seat, which was just super, super cool. So it really gives me goosebumps that we were able to do that. And he was funny because he basically said, "Don't ask me what any of these switches or buttons do anymore." But I don't believe that. I think he knows what they all do. I don't like to play favorites, but this is really one of my favorite objects, one of my favorite projects. This object is in the collection of the Freer-Sackler galleries. It's the Cosmological Buddha. It's a standing, robed Buddha figure that stands about 6 feet tall. It's about 1,400 years old. And if you walk into the gallery, it's just a really compelling object. Every inch of all the surfaces has this low relief carving across the entire robed figure. Now, if you read the text panel that's on exhibit, it's maybe 500 words, and it doesn't even scratch the surface of the volumes of information that are encoded in this object. And the curator thinks that this object was created as a teaching tool to teach about Buddhism. So the traditional method of documentation is ink and charcoal rubbings on paper. So 100 years ago, this was an acceptable thing to do. It was a way to kind of show these scenes graphically and share them by mailing the pieces of paper around. By today's conservation standards, this is not something that they want happening. So we used a laser scanner and some photogrammetry tools. We combined those two different data sets, and we passed off some draft renderings to the curator, Keith Wilson, and he started to decode this object and sort of circling different areas that he knows connect to different areas of Buddhist scripture. So that was kind of like the back and forth and the conversation we had to create the narrative using the 3D model as a storytelling tool. So a photograph on the left, a 3D rendering of our data on the right with the stone texture stripped out. And then we're able to do other things. Think about the way we have a globe, and then we could unwrap that into 2D space to create a map. We're doing a similar thing with this object, where we have a 3D scan of this cosmological Buddha with an incredible amount of information being conveyed through these carvings. So we essentially unwrapped that 3D model into flat space. So for the first time, we can look at that narrative in one go. All right, so I'm going to jump into the live demo. Let's see if this works. It's working. Okay, so our 3D viewer, this is something else we worked on in collaboration with Autodesk. So we're able to do some things. This is happening in my browser. So if you go to 3d.si.edu, you can explore our 3D models. So we could do some things like look at the shoulders. This is something you couldn't do if you're in the gallery because it's on a pedestal. Unless you were really tall, you couldn't really see that part of the object. And I won't go into all these different tool sets, but I'll just highlight a few of them. We could do a number of things. We could turn off that stone texture and look at just the geometry. And then I can adjust the ambient occlusion maps, and I could start to pull out details that are hard to see with the naked eye. Now this looks like a Photoshop filter, but it's actually an algorithm that's darkening areas of high curvature and lightening areas of low curvature. And this tool in particular was very helpful for the researcher to see details that were hard to see otherwise. So I'm going to pull that back. Another thing we're able to do with the 3D viewer is we can click on the hotspot areas. And now we can start to click around on these different hot areas, and we start to discover that down low there are all these scenes depicting hell up to the animal kingdom, to humans, all the way up to enlightenment around the shoulders. And then we also worked with the curator, and really the whole goal of this project was to marry the power of 3D assets that we could deliver those over the web and really connect it with the content expert so we could do storytelling. So you can see we have about 7 different what we're calling guided tours. And with the guided tour, we can essentially click through these different viewpoints that we're zooming to, and then we have additional information popping up on the right. At this point, we're working with the curator and creating these tours behind the scenes. Our dream is to open up this functionality so that anyone, any scholar or teacher, can create these 3D guided tours on their own. So that's one of our dreams and something we're trying to work towards. So you can see we have a lot of functionality that you would normally see in 3D software, and this is just happening in a browser. And then we can adjust lighting conditions. We can also take measurements on the model. And we can also do things. For this model, the cross-section tool might not be super helpful, but we can adjust the cross-section and maybe examine that cavity and take a measurement there. And then with all of those parameters I just adjusted, we click the share button and a unique URL is generated so I can share this scene. Or I can grab the embed code and we can embed this in our website and our blog in the same way we would embed a YouTube video. So the 5 projects I just described, that was really our strategy because we're a 5-person team, and our big question was, how does a 5-person team have an impact on an institution as large as the Smithsonian? So we would go big on these projects like the command module, the Cosmological Buddha. And really what we're trying to do over the next 2 years is how do we document entire collections of Smithsonian objects? So we already have precedent with conveyor belts for 2D digitization efforts. We're working with Virginia Tech, and you can see in the top left-hand corner, that's kind of a design document that involves a robotic arm that's grabbing onto standardized containers that hold wet specimens, so we can micro-CT scan wet specimen collections. And next week, I'm actually off to Darmstadt in Germany. There's a group, the Fraunhofer IGD, they've created an automated 3D scanning device that we're investigating and looking possibly to bring to the Smithsonian. So we think that we have this incredible opportunity to marry this technology with all of these incredible objects that we have behind the scenes, as well as the curators, the researchers, the educators who have studied these objects. And we think the potential of combining these things will be very powerful. So a great quote by my entomologist friend, Matt Buffington, you don't have to shake a tree in the rainforest to discover a new species. You could do it right here in the collections of the Natural History Museum. And this has happened. This has happened a number of times where a new species was discovered and it was sitting in a drawer or on a shelf in suburban Maryland. So our existing pipeline, everything we do right now is hard and manual. So we're using tools that are not really fit for purpose. We're adapting from Hollywood, engineering, and aerospace industries, and we're building pipelines around that. It requires a high degree of expertise to 3D scan, the processing even more so, and sometimes up to 10 different pieces of software that we have to use to create these derivatives so we could deliver on mobile platforms, 3D printing platforms, and virtual reality. And then we have this amazing viewer that we created in collaboration with Autodesk, but it's just one platform. So we're hoping to expand upon that. So our new pipeline that we're very excited about, and everything you see here, this is kind of a greatly simplified version of our platform. This will all be open sourced. And it's built in a very modular way because we know this technology is going to evolve quickly, and we need to be able to swap out components as opposed to creating some monolithic pipeline that would be difficult to maintain and update over time. So we're using a number of motion control systems. Here we have a cast of Abraham Lincoln by Leonard Volk that's going to guide us through this new proposed pipeline. We have an array of sensors and a turntable so that we can put an object on the table and 3D scan that object, removing a lot of the manual work of capture. We're also creating a 3D repository, so 3D metadata standards simply don't exist. So we have the Smithsonian 1.0 version of a 3D capture metadata model that we've established, and we're working with a number of other universities and museums. So this is not really the standard yet, but it's a start, and that informs the development of this 3D repository that we're creating, which will also be open sourced. And then the automated pipeline. This is really one of the most important components. If you spend an hour 3D scanning an object, you're going to spend 10 hours processing that data. So building in automation is really key if we want to scale up this effort. And then a viewer-agnostic authoring tool. So what that means really is that if I'm working with Dr. Keith Wilson and he's creating this experience around the Cosmological Buddha, if he's adding annotations, creating storytelling, I want to be able to save the coordinates of every one of those annotations so that this would not just be an experience that's contained in this one-off platform, that could then proliferate to other 3D platforms and also be archived and become a part or a history of the 3D model and a record of the 3D model. So that viewer-agnostic authoring tool is really important because trying to stay on top of 3D viewing platforms is kind of a Sisyphean task, and the Smithsonian really isn't poised. We're not a software company, so that tool is super important. And that ultimately feeds to the Smithsonian 3D portal that we started developing. So this is a Smithsonian 3D API, an application programming interface, so that we have our scan of Abraham Lincoln or a collection of scans, and then we want to deliver to all of the platforms right now. So we see this ecosystem of platforms that accept and leverage 3D data growing exponentially right now. We're also developing an open source 3D viewer, so our current viewer is not open source. Our new viewer will be open source. And then we want to connect to web-based platforms. We see Google, Bing, Sketchfab, a number of these web-based 3D viewing solutions that are becoming available. Wikimedia just announced that they're accepting 3D data, I think 3 weeks ago. And Facebook as well. So you can now drag and drop a 3D model into your Facebook newsfeed the same way you would an image or a video of your kids. Research platforms like iDigBio and Duke University's MorphoSource we're looking at connecting to, as well as providing Smithsonian 3D content as a resource for app developers for iOS and Android devices. Desktop applications like Microsoft Office. Apparently Microsoft Office is 3D ready, so not a lot of people know that, but you can just drag and drop a 3D model into PowerPoint now. 3D printing platforms, and then VR and AR I think is incredibly exciting. There's a tremendous amount of hype around VR right now, but I think if you have a chance to get into a VR system, if you're looking at the right experience, for me the powerful experience was the command module, actually feeling that what it's like to be inside the command module and just that cramped space and looking at all these switches and just it's mind-boggling. And then different cloud-based softwares as well we're looking at connecting to. So future launches, we're partnering with the Hydrus. That's a nonprofit out of California that uses different types of technology to allow people to have an emotional connection to the oceans and to coral reef bleaching events. So our team at the Smithsonian, we're 3D scanning a collection of corals that was collected over 100 years ago. So that's kind of the benchmark of where these species should be pre-climate change, dealing with and then working with the Hydrus, and their team is basically doing underwater 3D scanning and virtual reality capture of these coral reef bleaching events. This is an exciting project for us. We also had a successful Kickstarter campaign that we collaborated with the Air and Space Museum. This involves documenting Neil Armstrong's spacesuit, making that data available to the world. And then the nation's T-Rex. This is a fun one. So this was scanned a few years ago, but there's an enormous amount of processing that has to happen. And we scanned every single bone before the object was articulated, and then we scanned the articulated specimen. So we're working with the Natural History Museum on a launch date. But soon you too can have your own nation's T-Rex in your living room. This is a very recent announcement. So just 2 days ago, we announced our partnership with Google. This involves light field capture. And light field capture is basically, it's a little bit different than the 3D scanning technology I was just talking about. It's documenting the way that light hits objects and is reflected back into our eyes. So we're actually doing a form of essentially light scanning. And that's really great for hyper-realistic virtual reality experiences. And it's good to see that that project is getting some good press with the MIT Media Review as well as The Verge. And we were working with Paul Debevec. He's formerly of USC. He helped us 3D scan Barack Obama a few years ago. So again, if you want to check out more of our work, learn more, you can simply Google Smithsonian 3D. And something I'm really interested in is reaching out to you, the community. You know, we've built all these different tools within our 3D viewer, but we haven't thought of everything. So if you're interested, if you have the time, I'll leave this up on screen if you want to take a picture, and if you have a QR code reader, this will link you to a survey. So we're really interested in feedback, or you could simply just jot down the bit.ly or tweet at us. And at that, I want to thank you all for your attention, and it's been an honor to be here.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.